Fab, thank you very much, Nina. Can everyone here at the back? Yep. Good. Okay, so welcome along. My name's Stuart Duffy. I'm the founder of a charity called Pink Salter, based here in the office with Nina as well. I last held an Equalities Hustings up in Cowdenbeath for one of the last elections or referendums we had a wee while ago back in 2017. So thank you to the candidates who have decided to show up tonight. Just to be clear, we invited all 6 candidates that registered for the election. They were contacted by email, and each of the candidates was also sent a postal letter, a snail mail letter, does anyone still do that, to ask them to come along tonight. We have 3 candidates rather than each of the candidates represented. We have received notification from Gillian Cole-Hamilton at the Lib Dems that she was unable to make it, but she has sent an opening statement, which I'll read on her behalf at the start. We've had no contact from the Brexit Party candidate, and unfortunately the Conservative candidate, Kathleen Leslie, had another event that she had to attend tonight. So we've got the 3 that we've got. I think we'll make good use of their time tonight, hopefully with questions. So the format of this evening's hustings: each of the 3 candidates will be given around 2 minutes for an opening statement. We'll then move into, very briefly, the results of some of the survey questions that we asked you as you came in tonight. Elric's going to give us some information on that shortly. And then we'll move into questions from the floor. We've got lots of different themes for questions. Obviously, this is a Westminster election, and therefore we're looking at reserved matters rather than matters that are devolved to Holyrood. We'll give each of the candidates a time period to reply. And that will be fair across the board. And then at the end of the session, we'll give each of the candidates 2 minutes to wrap up. Does that sound okay? Good to go? All right, so let's start in no particular order with opening statements. And why don't I start with the Lib Dem opening statement, if that's all right? I'll give you a moment to catch your breath. Okay, so the opening statement from Gillian Cole-Hamilton at the Lib Dems then. The Liberal Democrats believe that in 21st century Britain, discrimination is something none of us should need to fear. We should all have the same opportunities regardless of where we come from or our circumstances. Our children and grandchildren should be who they want to be without any fear of persecution or intrusion. We believe in tearing down walls, not building them. We want to celebrate the diversity of the UK. However, discrimination based on gender, race, age, sexuality, gender identity, religion, or whether someone is disabled is still widespread. Across the UK, there has been an upturn in hate crimes, especially online. Almost 50 years after the Equal Pay Act, women are still paid less than men. But our vision for a brighter future is one free from discrimination and intolerance. Liberal Democrats have a proud history of initiating the changes we need, right back to being the first party to commit to a gay rights policy and same-sex marriage. Joe Swinson introduced shared parental leave and gender pay gap reporting. We introduced the pupil premium, giving extra help to children from poorer backgrounds, but there is still so much more to do. Those who choose to come to the UK to work in our NHS and schools, study at our universities or join our families should be welcomed for the skills and contributions that they bring. We need to give them a warm welcome, not meet them with a hostile environment. We will defend the Human Rights Act, the abolition of which we have blocked before. We will complete the reform of the Gender Recognition Act across the UK. We will increase statutory paternity leave from the current 2 weeks up to 6 weeks and make it a day one right. And we will radically expand childcare so that parents have more choice over how they organise their lives and women can return to work if they want to, tackling the gender pay gap. That is why every vote for the Liberal Democrats is a vote for a government with equality at the heart of its agenda. We stop Brexit, stop independence, and build a brighter future. The end. There we go. So, let's move to candidates. If I can ask you to press your red button when you're ready to, the green button when you're ready to speak, and switch it off when you're finished. Thank you. Let's start with Scott Rutherford for the Greens.
Sure. Hello everyone, thanks for having me here this evening. Thank you Stuart for hosting, it's greatly appreciated, and thank you to my fellow candidates for actually turning up. One more than last time and 3 out of the 6. not bad, but I think it shows you how serious the other parties are about their chances at this election. On myself, I was born in Kirkcaldy, lived here almost all my life. I've worked here in the constituency, commuted here, been unemployed here, understand the issues that matter to most local people, and I feel if I was elected as an MP, I would champion those issues. The constitutional future of this country is dominating at this election. It seems that we can't have proper discussion and debate because it takes up so much airtime, and for good reason. It's vitally important to the direction of the whole of the UK over the next couple of decades, the decisions it makes in the next 2 or 3 years. But I'm keen to move beyond that if we can tonight. I mean, there are so many local issues that matter so much to the everyday lives of normal people in this constituency, whether that's the decline in High Street in Kirkcaldy, unaffordable housing, whether that's low wages that have not kept up with inflation, whether that's the issue of Moss Mooring spewing its toxic fumes around Cowdenbeath, whether that's lack of investment in green energy, the energy of the future at Bifab. I think all these issues are incredibly important beyond just Brexit and independence, and I intend to give them some of the light that they should be given. By voting for me, people can elect someone who will enact and fight for a Green New Deal for Fife. Fife being one of Scotland's former industrial heartlands, we need to bring spirit back into this community. We weren't prepared when the age of coal ended. We're not prepared for the age of oil ending. And I'm determined that we come at that point where we are ready and that we don't let climate crisis be a runaway issue for us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott. Leslie Luke.
Well, good evening, and I'm delighted to be here. I think it's really important tonight that we are talking about issues about equality and social justice, because I think what we've seen through decades of both Liberals and Tories austerity is that fabric of our society has been deeply eroded away. Labour has a very proud track record on equality, whether that's campaigning on the streets, passing legislation in government. Labour is the only party to consistently stand with women, disabled people, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, LGBT+, and wider communities. On a more personal level, I have spent the majority of my working life working in human resources roles. I was a late starter to politics in 2012 and really have spent my whole career working in human resources, mainly in policy areas, particularly around equalities and justice in the workplace. Equalities, therefore, have to be, I believe, at the heart of our society. But while we all need to recognise that progress has been made, the culture created by this Tory government is now setting the tone for the rest of the society. And whether it's in the workplace or more generally in our society, Conservatives and Liberals have contributed to failed misery on all of those fronts. Through direct government poverty, over 85% of the burden of Liberal and Tory cuts has fallen on women. Through their policies, employment and immigration, Black, Asian, BAME and LGBT+ communities and disabled people have seen their rights diminish and their position in society marginalised. That's why, as part of our manifesto, we have an Equalities manifesto. We also have a Race and Faith manifesto, and today we have just launched our Disabilities manifesto. Equality is at the heart of the values of the Labour Party, and I am proud to stand for the Labour Party. We also need to recognise that it's also about understanding our shared experiences. We all bring something different each time we show up to any event, and what we need to try to establish going forward is a culture where that diversity is indeed truly valued.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that's your time up. And lastly, Neil Hanvey.
Thanks, Stuart, and thank you everyone for coming along tonight. It's great to see a brilliant turnout. As Stuart said, my name is Neil Hanvey. I'm a new Scot rather than a born Scot. I was born in Northern Ireland and I moved over to Scotland when I was 7 to Glenrothes. I trained at the Vic originally as a nurse, and I worked my career in mainly bone marrow transplant and adolescent cancer down in London, because in Scotland at that time there wasn't funding for permanent positions and there wasn't funding for education, and so moved down to London, came back here after devolution had happened, and I saw an absolute transformation in the confidence of the people in Scotland and a real change in social policy. And social policy has always been something that I've felt very strongly about. I think it's the engine that drives inequality if it's done badly. And as someone who grew up in Fife in the Thatcher years, I've watched communities be absolutely shattered by policies that didn't have anyone's real interest at heart, but they were ideologically driven. And here we are again with another Conservative government that have punished the poor and the disabled and marginalised more and more people in our communities. And we now are faced with the threat of Brexit. Brexit is not just a thing to get done. Brexit is probably the biggest threat to our sense of who we are as a country and who we are as people that we could ever imagine. It's a project that, again, is ideologically driven. It's designed to take away workers' rights, food and health standards, health and safety at work, environmental protections. All of these things are at risk. And going back to the start of my comment, the NHS is really important to me. It's been a big part of my life. And for that to be at risk from Boris Johnson, who said he's more than willing to take over the Scottish NHS, then I think that we need to elect someone who is prepared to go down to Westminster and make Scotland's voice heard, and with some power and authority. That is the fundamental question that we need to ask, because everything, all of the rights, all of the protections that we take for granted, and our access to free healthcare is at risk from Brexit. This is the biggest issue on the doorstep.
Sorry, Nick, to cut you off. I think we're going to get into all of those topics very soon. Before we get into questions then, let's have a look at how you decided to vote. Elric, I think he's behind me, is he ready to put up some stats around voting intention and topics that are important to you?
Can I get 5 minutes?
Oh, he's not ready yet.
Oh, there was going to be 3 more statements.
Right, okay, let's move on to the first question. We'll come back to voting intention and some of the important issues. Tonight we have some roving mics, so we'll be asking people to stick their hand up just a minute for some questions. We're going to open, though, with a first set question to get the debate up and running, and we'll give each of the candidates a set period of time. We've said 3 minutes, but because there's less candidates, we'll probably let them go on a little bit longer if you're happy to do that. So we're going to open with this question. How will the candidates support policies which tackle hatred and discrimination in our society, including Islamophobia, transphobia and anti-Semitism? Neil Hanvey, let's start with you.
Thanks, Stuart. This is obviously an issue that I am currently dealing with presently. I don't think that'll be a surprise to anybody here. However, this is fundamentally a question of justice and also a question of equality. And I've always kind of used ethical theories in my practice to underpin the decision-making process that I go through when I'm examining any kind of situation. And at the heart, for me anyway, at the heart of the equalities question is something that's 2,000 years old, and it's a principle that Aristotle presented, and it's that equals should be treated equally and unequals should be treated unequally. Now, that doesn't mean that unequals get treated less well. What it means is that unequals have to have acknowledgement of their special status and accommodation to make them feel whole in any community or society. And so I guess the thing there is that we need to look at every issue, regardless of what policy it is, regardless of the circumstance, and ask ourselves very important questions. Now, the way that we do that at the moment is through something called an EQI assessment, and that looks at equalities, looks at protected characteristics, those kind of things, and we try to deal with them and balance the needs of different communities within our society in that way. But the only way to tackle that is to try and live as an authentic principle as you possibly can. Sometimes people make mistakes within that, and I think apologies are an important part of how you deal with that. But the fundamental problem that we've got in terms of tackling racism and disableism and a whole range of things at the moment is we've got a Conservative government that doesn't care about any of those things. We've got a Conservative government who is led by a man who has a catalogue of pejorative comments that he has made that no one is prepared to hold him to account, and he won't say sorry. He's been given the opportunity to say sorry so many times, but he refuses to do so. And, my mum is a great inspiration to me, she always has been, but one of the things that she always taught me was, if you make a mistake, own up for it, take responsibility for it and apologise, and then try and make amends. And that is something that has always been very important to me, and I thank my mum for that.
Thank you, Neil. Leslie Laird.
Well, I think the first thing that I've kind of touched on in my introduction was really the polarisation I think that we see in our society. No matter what the issue, there is a polarisation of black or white. There's never any shades of grey. And I think when we particularly, to address your point about hate crimes and anti-Semitism and other forms of threat, I think, to the values and principles that I think we would probably all recognise and have grown up with, is that it really starts with each and every one of us to recognise that things are out of kilter, and to recognise that each and every one of us has a part to play in how we adjust that, how we stand up for that, and how we speak out for that and call that behaviour out when we know that it's fundamentally wrong. And that's why I think so much of this also starts with education. I think a lot of the events that we've seen, and I think we can look across all parties and see that we have not had our troubles to seek in terms of people understanding that there are certain things that are just completely and utterly inappropriate. And that is why I do believe that education is so important. It's also about building that shared experience that I touched on in my introduction. Because if you're not aware of other people's circumstances, if you've never walked in their shoes, then you can't possibly understand the lived experiences that they've had. And it is important, therefore, that we conduct that dialogue in an open and a respectful way, but we embed that as part of our education process. I think it's also about recognising that we are a multicultural society, and that as such, we need to give respect to whatever places of worship people choose to worship, and to ensure that they have the protections that they need to worship safely. Because from what we've seen through some of the attacks in recent times, is that people are going to what they would consider a safe haven for worship, and finding that that is no longer safe for them. And the Labour Party in its manifesto has committed to support all faiths in terms of ensuring that the places of worship can be safe for them. I think it's also important to touch on the rise of the right, and that comes back to the intolerance that I think we've seen. The whipping up of nationalism, particularly in English nationalism, but nationalism in many forms does cause polarisations of views. And what we've seen with Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage is that whipping up of nationalism, that polarisation, and that blaming the ills of the economy on people who are considered to be different from us. I think it's also, in terms of addressing it, about leadership. And that's why I'm delighted that the Labour Party's manifesto is so strong on equality, that we will appoint a Shadow Secretary of State to actually look at the issues that we are talking about here tonight, about equality, about social justice, about tolerance, and all of these things that underpin the values of which our society should be based on. And therefore, I believe that if we embrace a Labour government at this election, then we can indeed change the agenda and change the tone and culture of our society.
Thank you, Leslie. Time's up. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, I think briefly I'll just touch on Boris Johnson as well, who, as the weeks go by in this election campaign, it just seems there doesn't seem to be one single marginalised group in society that he's not willing to insult, whether that's single mothers, fathers, working class children, black people, gay people. There's a real sustained ignorance, profound ignorance and cruelty that comes from this man who cannot speak for himself tonight, whose representative has not bothered turning up, because I imagine there's plenty she just could not defend from this man. But beyond that, the ignorance and the cruelty stemming from doesn't belong in the 21st century. I'm very proud of how we do politics differently in Scotland. We seem to be that bit more embracing. I think there's plenty of deep-rooted problems in our social and political fabric around homophobia, sexism, racism, misogyny, all this. But I tend to think we're a bit more inclusive. On that, the Scottish Government can legislate. This isn't strictly Westminster related, I realise, but please, Stuart, give me a minute. The Scottish Government can legislate on some issues. They do have some devolved competency over this. The GRA, which hopefully meets the Chamber before 2021, is a great opportunity for us to recognise the rights of LGBT plus community. I think that this is something we absolutely have to do. There's an onus on us as politicians to reach out to people, to stop people shrinking away from their full potential, to bring people out of the dark. And I think there's many in Scotland who just can't get their heads around this. Portions of the SNP, portions of Labour just can't seem to get their head around that conflating trans people with rapists in the same sentence, in the same paragraph, is not a way to view any equality. I just don't see where this comes from. Perhaps that's the result of my age. I don't know. This is just an issue some older people can't get their head around. I don't know. I sincerely hope we deal with that in Scotland. And I believe we can. I've never had problems with any of these fundamental issues. Empathy and respect underpin my thinking. I think it's such a shame that there are sections of Scottish politics and society that can't. But if elected, I want to take everyone with me. I think that's what all MPs should do. Let's be an example.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, so on this issue of tackling hatred in society, any comments, questions from the floor? If you put your hand up, we've got roving mics on either side, so someone will come to you to make your point or ask your question. Yes, lady in the middle there, you were the first hand up. Someone's going to come to you with a mic, just give us a second.
I'm not that fast. Thank you. I'd like to pick up on something that Leslie said there, that far too many times the discussions are fairly black and white. Now, I've been trying to meet you for over a year, and I've been writing to you about women's rights, and I would like to know, how can we bring nuance to a debate like women's rights if you are not willing to meet both sides?
Okay, we'll take a couple more interventions and then we'll get the candidates to reply. Yes, lady at the back there with the hand up, Pat. Yep. You've got a choice of microphones tonight.
Hiya, I'll just be very brief. I personally deplore the atrocities that Israel has perpetrated on the Palestinians. I think it's awful. I think they're getting away with it. Nobody is speaking out against it because they think to do so would class them as being anti-Semitic. I am speaking out against it. Does that make me anti-Semitic tonight?
Thank you. Okay, let's put those points to the candidates. Leslie, do you want a chance to reply first?
Well, I think we do have to bring people together, and I think we do have to have that dialogue. I think we would all recognise that the whole issues about equality and gender recognition is one that requires wider debate and wider understanding. We were just having a conversation at the start about how we take that message out and how we engage with groups that you might typically not expect to want to engage in those issues. And I do believe it's important that we open up that dialogue. I think it also can be, again, I think quite a challenging subject for people to understand. And I'll go back to my earlier points about education. I think it's not enough to set out legislation. I think it's also about how we educate, how we dialogue, how we talk about that. And I'm happy to meet with you. I'm sorry if I haven't met you to date, but it's not that I shy away from any of those issues, and it's not that I am not open to dialoguing on those difficult subjects, because I recognise we've got lots of challenges in our society, and the whole basis of how I've operated both in my working life and as MP has been to actually get people round the table and to talk and to dialogue. I believe nothing is resolved by standing shouting at each other across a table. I think we've got to broaden up that debate, but I think we also need to recognise there are barriers to helping that understanding, and it's organisations like the Equalities organisation that are hosting this tonight who play such a vital part in actually helping to raise that level of awareness into other parts of our community. In relation to the Israeli-Palestine, I think if we look across the Middle East as a whole, we would probably all just feel so sad, I think, at the waste, the polarisation of views and the difficulties that are faced by people who are caught up in all sorts of conflicts across the Middle East. I think there is no doubt that the ladies touched on there, I couldn't quite see where you were, around how do you have a sensible discussion about the behaviours in relation to what Israel is doing as part of its policy versus what it's doing in terms of its treatment. And all of these things are really difficult. And the Labour Party has been clear that if we were elected, we would be recognising Palestine as an individual state. So there is much to be done. I think foreign policy under the Conservative governments has been somewhat difficult. And again, I think Emily Thornberry would bring a very different culture to a values-based foreign policy approach. And I'm sure many of you here would probably agree with many of the approaches that Emily would want to take in relation to how that dialogue is conducted in relation to foreign policy.
Okay, Leslie, thank you. Let's move on to Scott. Do you want to respond to both those issues?
Just a second. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair comment to criticise the actions of any state on their military policy on how they respect human rights. I think distinguishing the state of Israel from people who are Jewish, from people who are Israeli and Palestinian is absolutely fair comment. I think the way these discourses are handled online often comes across as crass, and when people are trying to make respectful comments veer into the passive-aggressive too easily. I think social media can make a fool of us all at times. Authoritarianism, I'll just add, is on the rise nationally. Issues around the fundamental rights of humans, around freedom of movement, are under threat. I want to see a 21st century Scotland that's outward looking, that embraces people, that has its arms open to the world, so tied closely to the way we treat humans and give them rights and dignity. I think migration has to come into that. Borders can be scars across this planet that divide people upon a line that's been drawn in the sand. I think we do a good job of educating our young people, of respecting people, of bringing people in. I'll just add, foreign policy can be an effective way to make these changes if we respect, notice, engage with nations, have closer ties with nations who respect the rights of LGBT plus people. We can make those changes. Soft diplomacy can definitely be more effective than the hard arm of military. And I think Scotland and the UK should certainly be adopting that as its first approach with any foreign power negotiation, and not purely taking the military route as has been disproved by governments, Labour, Tory, and the US in the past 10 and 20 years. They've been a disaster. Negotiation has to be the way forward when stakes are so high. Thanks.
Thank you. Neil?
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so taking the first issue around women's voices in the GRA debate. it's not a secret to anyone that I've been reasonably clear about women's voices, and certainly sense from women that they're not being heard in the debate. And if I set out my kind of journey very briefly on this. So when the equal marriage legislation was achieved, the Equality Network had a consultation. I attended that consultation in Edinburgh and was part of the group who agreed that trans rights and visibility and acceptance were really important issues, and I still hold that belief today. What has become, I think, really challenging for me is some of the language that has transferred principally from the American debate, which is, and I use that term very loosely, to the UK, where anyone who has a concern is immediately given a very pejorative label. And so I have tried to engage with all the groups. I had a fantastic meeting with James Morton from Scottish Trans Alliance. It was very, very helpful. And I also had a very constructive meeting with For Women Scotland. And I think that there are so many common aims. I haven't picked up any transphobia from any of the women's groups. And thankfully, I haven't picked up anything that I would categorise as misogyny from the trans group. But it seems so difficult to have that conversation, but it's such an important conversation to have. And it goes back to that point I made right at the beginning about equals being treated equally and unequals being treated unequally. That's a foundational principle that you can use to explore every change in legislation. And I think whilst the GRA has got nothing to do with the Equalities Act has come into the discussion, and therefore there's some ambiguity about how things are defined, how they're structured, what construct means what. And so there's a really important conversation to happen there. And it is never going to be achieved by calling each other names. I think one other comment I would like to make is that when someone talks, for me anyway, with my background, risk management and the management of safety is a big part of running a large part of the NHS. You have to have that vision to look for any risks. And, you know, I think we all have a responsibility, regardless of which community you belong to participate in risk management. So,
You chat you to wrap up, Neil.
okay. Can I still speak? Yeah, so that's a really important issue. So we need dialogue. Sorry, I went on a bit longer than expected.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions, so we're really keen to get through as many as we possibly can. Okay, so I think it's now time to go back to Elric and just confirm with us what our voting intentions. Sorry, well, I think the candidates have answered the question in the way that the candidates have had the opportunity to answer the question.
It's a simple yes or no, yeah?
I'd like to say.
I think they've all had the opportunity to answer that question in the time period that we gave them.
For a yes, no, I'd be interested to hear the answer.
I think we're going to move on to some other topics because there's lots to get through. So, Elric, do you want to have a go? Tell us where are our voting intentions and what are some of the topics that were most important to people as we came through the doors.
Okay, so let's see if that works briefly. Yeah, so these are the initial voting intentions.
Not colour-coded, Elric, jeez.
No, sorry, that's random. I don't choose those, I'm sorry. So at initial voting intentions, 0% for the Liberal Democrats and Scottish Conservative in this county. That is initially the 0 and 1 in the middle. 55% for Neil Handley from the Independent Party at the moment. We have 16 and 16% equal, that is in second position for Leslie Laird and undecided. And we have 11% for Scott Rutherford, Scottish Green Party at this moment.
Oh, so, his name is not on it.
So it didn't display, so that's, that's a formatting. So
it's your orange on there.
So you're at 11%. So that's, it's not color-coded, but that's you here. I'll make sure it actually displays the right color for the next slide. Sorry, it's not the same screen on the other one. Okay, so the topics that matter tonight, obviously at the very top, austerity and universal credit welfare reform. That's the most at 18.3%. That's this one here. The next topic that matters today is definitely Scottish independence stroke Scottish referendum, 17.8%. So that's also 18 on that screen, sorry. The next down the line at 3 equal positions are Brexit and EU withdrawal, climate change, climate emergency, equality and human rights at 13% each of them, one here and one there. And next, taxation and public spending, that's at 10.7% or 11, that's on this side here. Terrorism and counter-terrorism law is at 7%, that's here. We had 2 votes for women's rights, which is at 1%, which is on this side, but in the club of all this it was taken as part of equality and human rights. But I'll make sure to create a new option for it in the next board. So anyway, that's where we are tonight. So this one and the next one.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulrich. All right, so I think we're getting a call from someone. An important question, maybe. This was a slide that we just wanted to clarify what some of the issues are that are reserved to Westminster compared to devolved matters for Holyrood, just to give you some clarification around some of the questions and the themes of questions that we'd like you to try and stick to tonight. We're likely to talk about issues around Brexit and austerity, Scottish independence, the environment. Those all came out, as you could see, as some of the top issues there. So let's crack on with more questions. We have some set questions around different themes, but we're very happy to open it up. The next section we'd like to move on to is around disabilities. Today is International Day for People with Disabilities. The Independent earlier this year reported that more than 17,000 people had died while waiting on their PIP assessment. How can dignity be restored to the welfare system? Let's start with Scott.
Yeah, so my uncle was hauled up for an assessment of his disabilities about 2 years ago after the Tories reintroduced some sort of welfare reform. He's been disabled his whole life, is unable to tell you what food he wants sometimes, never mind work. I think the way we treat people like that who are wholly dependent on our helping them, to routinely drag them up like that, like they're some common animal, is just disgusting. I think it tells you a lot about the way the Tory government respect human rights, the way they respect people in this country. I find it absolutely disgusting. How we have dignity and welfare. I believe there are more social security powers being devolved to Scotland. I'm aware that the Scottish Government have introduced some legislation, for example, where people who are attending work-based interviews in their job centres, they are allowed to bring someone along to have with them, to help them, to coach them if need be through these interviews, which are not only harassing at times, intimidating, scary. You speak wrong, you turn up late, that's it, your money's withdrawn, you've got to go to a food bank. Okay, not a great situation to be. If you're in Kirkcaldy, even worse, because they're running a huge deficit. The amount of food poverty in this constituency. How we're bringing dignity is introducing, and well, perhaps devolving, more powers to Scotland for a start, but introducing legislation that actually respects people, that doesn't treat everyone like a scrounger in waiting. It treats people who are unemployed as people who are between jobs, helps them into employment, doesn't punish them. And I think devolution of that could go a long way. Perhaps giving what we're calling UBI, Universal Basic Income, to people might be an alternative route as well. Might be something that it essentially guarantees people a certain amount of money per month, whether they're in work or not. Once you earn a certain amount in the higher tax brackets, that's withdrawn. It could help in income equality. It could help reduce child poverty. It could help reduce homelessness. It could go a huge way to helping people. And I'd hope we can enact something like that in the next couple of years. Should it be devolved? Should we have more powers on it?
Thanks, Scott. Neil Hamby.
Thanks, Stuart. I have a pretty short answer to this, really. At the moment, we have devolution of some powers over welfare, and the Scottish Government has aimed to put dignity at the heart of that policy. These devolved powers were always designed to make things more difficult for the Scottish Government than easier, so they were a basket that were, I guess, felt to be the tricky ones. But I think Shirley Ann and her team have done a very good job in actually delivering that dignity at the heart. But the fundamental thing is, this is not about devolving more powers. It's not, devolution is not an answer to sorting out the welfare system that the Tories design. The solution for designing a welfare system that we are happy with, that has dignity at the heart, is through independence. I mean, it's, you know, that is the only answer. Because I look at the welfare state and the way that it's delivered and the cruelty that's inbuilt to it, and I just think that's not the way we would do things if we had the power to do it. So I don't see the point in asking for bits and pieces. Give us all of the power. We will do a much, much better job of it as an independent country. And if I've still got time, I want to skip back to the answer I didn't have the opportunity to give a response to, which is, I think the point is really important, that we're able, and it's really important for me at the moment, to find the correct words to express something that is deeply upsetting. And talking about my own experience, the context of that, not an excuse, but the context of that was, I had spent that week watching teenagers and children being shot indiscriminately in Palestine, and I was emotional about it, I was angry, and I probably could have chosen much more constructive words. But that was the visceral feeling that I had, and I'm paying for that, if you like, now. But the fundamental issue here is call-out culture. You know, if you get called out for every misspoke or mispresented thing and silenced, then we will never progress. We need to dispense with this. Call that person out, make them suffer, you know, drag their, you know, I'm now defined by one comment in Facebook rather than a lifetime of service to the NHS, and that's really, really difficult to deal with. You know, it's a horrible feeling. And the worst thing for me is not how I feel. The worst thing for me is that it minimises the real issue.
Thanks, Neil. Leslie Luke, thank you.
Well, there's a very simple solution to how we can restore dignity, both in welfare but also dignity in work, because the two things are not unrelated. If you elect a Labour government on the 12th of December, we will be abolishing universal credit. So all of the issues that we have talked about tonight in relation to the undignifying welfare system that we have is absolutely at the heart of the Labour Party manifesto. Having met with so many people who have been subject to horrific assessments, having worked with so many local groups, and I see Maureen up the back, I couldn't see you when you spoke earlier, then all of these things are absolutely at the heart of what the Labour Party is about and what we will do if elected. We will dispense with the wait time, the indignifying wait time. I was driving back from Glasgow and I heard the debate tonight about really examining, I think for the first time I've heard them examine non-constitutional issues and really looking at the abject poverty that so many people, not just in this constituency, but actually across the country are now living in. With estimated to have 5 million children into poverty by 2024, something has to be done, and that is about changing who is the occupier of number 10 Downing Street. It's also about making sure we scrap the rape clause, scrap the two-child cap, and we start to really address the fundamental issues of child poverty. But it's also the flip side of that. The reason why we've got so many people in work poverty is because we've got employers who are not paying decent wages. We've got employers who have taken advantage of the Tories' laissez-faire approach to dignity at work. And for those reasons, we will be repealing the trade union bill. We will be putting in place a £10 minimum wage from the minute that we are in government. In this constituency alone, that lifts nearly 14,000 people above the rate of pay that they are currently on. We will also be addressing the whole issue around how we treat people in the workplace by banning 0 hours contract. You will have employment rights from day one. So it's not just one or the other, it's about balancing both sides of the equation, because bad employers, and there's lots of good employers, but people have taken advantage of the flex security or the gig economy. It's not a gig economy if you can't pay your rent, if you can't feed your family, and you have to choose between heating and eating. That isn't a lifestyle choice, and that isn't the basis around which we want to have our society live. And it's not what the Labour Party is about, and that's why I am delighted to stand on a manifesto that has said and committed from day one that that is what we will do. We will restore dignity to welfare, and we will restore dignity to work.
Thank you, candidates. Questions from the floor around welfare, around austerity, impact on minorities. Gentleman at the back here with the black jacket on, Pat. Thank you.
Hi all. You speak about... Is this mic on?
Yep, we can hear you.
You speak about universal credit and the Tories and eliminating universal credit, but nobody's actually set out what kind of plan they have to what they would replace universal credit with. You all speak about getting rid of it, but surely we need something, a well thought through plan on what we're going to replace it with before we look at getting rid of it.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, the gentleman right at the back there. Yep.
Yeah, can I ask, Leslie, you said that when Labour get in, you're going to reverse all these things that the Tories have done. And that's fine, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you do that. But what are you going to do about in 5 years' time when the Tories come back? Or 10 years when the Tories come back, they will just unravel everything that you've done and we'll be back to where we are again. Every evil policy that the Tories have will be brought back in when they get back in power. How are you going to solve that? It's called democracy, by the way. Yeah,
okay,
we
thank
don't
you.
have democracy in this country.
That's a couple of questions for the candidates to mull over. Neil, let's start with you first in response to those issues.
Okay, so universal credit and what would you do it? I think, I can't remember the exact name of it. It always seems to escape my mind, but where we have a universal payment to each individual in the community. That kind of structure to welfare is universal basic income, I think it's called, yeah. That kind of principle, I think, is a really good foundation to start, because if you do that, then you rescue people from the trap of poverty. They can't be sanctioned for that. That will always be there, and that's a really important foundation for them to build a future, to be able to have some security that they can look for work, that they won't be out in the streets. So I think it's a really important principle to stop poverty. And the reason that that's important is because when you make that investment, you save a huge amount of money on pressures on the health service, on policing, on a whole range, social work, criminal justice. I mean, you can go on and on and on. But if you're able to take some of that inequity away with a universal income, I think that's a really important starting point. On the other point, it would be no surprise for me to say that we have gone through enough changes from Labour to Tory, changing each other's policies that are never right for Scotland. It's time to just call a halt to that. It absolutely is. We can do a much better job as an independent country. We can have a welfare system that accommodates and accepts people, that doesn't stigmatise them, throw them out onto the streets, take their bedroom away from them when they're disabled and they need a storage space. I mean, God, I could go on about it for ages, but the injustice that is visited on Scotland is a result of Westminster. It's a result of Labour, Tory, Tory, Labour. You know, I mean, we will never get the government that we vote for. I mean, Scotland used to, because they used to vote Labour, so sometimes you would get a Labour government, but it wasn't because of the Scottish vote. And now we don't vote Labour, so they, you know, I'm talking not being pejorative to Leslie, but as a nation, we don't really vote Labour anymore, so not in the way that I used to and many of you used to. So we need a different government because they don't reflect our values any longer.
Okay, thanks for that. Scott, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think, to be fair, I kind of did lay out one of our proposals to, an alternative proposal to universal credit as it is now, and that would be UBI, Universal Basic Income. Basically, it's a block payment you receive every single month, regardless of whether you're employed or not, and that is gradually phased out as you earn more and enter the higher tax brackets. I think it gives such a great opportunity for people to have that stability in their life that they just do not have now. It allows entrepreneurs to gamble on a business idea should they want it. It pays unpaid care work and allows people to look after their relatives, which isn't paid now and is mostly done by women. And it's part of the reason why the gender pay ratio is so high. I think it's 87 pence, 70 pence or something. Every woman earns to the pound against the man. That's atrocious. It's a huge bubble of inequality and something that in the 21st century we definitely should be putting up with. People do need more say over that. Our values definitely aren't reflected down south. I think Scotland has a keener sense of social justice, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Scotland's a left-wing, left-leaning country. England is becoming more isolationist. It's through its liar, useless politicians, it's scapegoating people like never before. There's one way out of this chaos, and I believe it's Scottish independence, where we have full powers and we make those decisions on our own.
Thank you, Scott. Leslie.
If I take that gentleman's point first, so what we've said is that there are immediate things we can do, and the reason we've identified those things is actually working with groups that I've mentioned here, working with Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So there are some things we can absolutely fundamentally change from that first starting point. So that's things like the 5-week wait time, which I outlined. It's repealing the 2 rape clause. So there are things that we do not need to have legislation for, but there are things that we can absolutely do that we have taken on board from users who have been penalised by the system that we believe we can fix from day one, and that will make such a difference to many, many people. And that has been based on real lived experiences for individuals who have gone through that system, but also working with various groups, third sector charities, that have been trying to support and mitigate what should be a core function of the welfare state, and under this Tory government has basically been a burden, I believe, for many areas. So, for example, I know from speaking to the food bank, the pressure that the food bank is under on a regular basis to try to ensure that they have enough food to make sure that they can meet the needs of people who come through their doors. That is a real and difficult challenge, because what you've then got is the stress and strain which should be there taken care of by the welfare system, by being picked up by volunteers in our community. And thank goodness that they are there, but that isn't how we had set up our welfare system, and that is not how our welfare system should work. And when Labour in government, we will restore the dignity into that welfare system. I want to just touch, before I do come on the universal basic income. So when I was deputy leader of Fife Council, we actually started a pilot, a piece of work, looking at universal basic income. That was part of my brief, as part of my economy brief. I was involved in that work kicking off. That work is still underway. Fife is one of, I think, 3 local authorities who are looking at that, and that work is still ongoing. So I do believe that you have to maintain that. In relation to the self-fulfilling prophecy about the Tories, I'm afraid I am not of that belief. I believe that if you get a Labour government this time around with a radical agenda both on wages and dignity and welfare, dignity and work, a radical house building programme, a radical green agenda for climate change, bringing jobs and reindustrialising communities like this, then the Tories won't have a look in, they won't get back in, because people like all of us will realise the benefit of having a Labour government in Westminster.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I can hear some rumblings out there. Any additional questions around austerity, welfare? Gentleman in the front here, and we've got another gentleman here with his hand up too. One on this side and one on this side. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you. A couple of the candidates have spoken about the importance of Scottish independence in order to stop this Tory-Labour seesaw. To my horror, I've noticed in the last 3 elections, I think, a radical rise in people voting Tories. We used to have more pandas in Scotland than Tory MPs. We've got now 12 or 13 or something. 5 councillors riddled with them. So here's the thing. How are we going to safeguard in an independent Scotland that we're not going to end up with the Tories running Scotland and Jeremy Corbyn running the rest of the UK? And in the interest of balance, for Leslie, language is important. According to the United Nations, there is no conflict in Israel-Palestine. There's an illegal occupation, there's apartheid, there's ethnic cleansing. That's not my opinion. That's the United Nations.
Okay, and the gentleman just here.
As somebody who's on universal credit, somebody who's suffering from anxiety and depression and been made redundant and whatnot, I was on job seekers allowance at a young age, but recently been put onto universal credit. My question for Leslie is, I mean, both Neil and Scott have both said about UBI, but you haven't really made it clear whether you support that idea as well, or whether or not by scrapping universal credit you're just going to go back to the job seekers, income support and everything else, you know, and still have to go through assessments. You know, I mean, I had 2 knee operations and I was sent twice up to get assessed, and both times judged fit for work, and then I had my knee operation. So whether or not you support the idea of UBI and whether or not you would push for that kind of thing in Parliament, or whether or not you just think to yourself, right, okay, we'll get rid of universal credit and go back to the way it was before, which didn't work either.
Okay, I think we'll give Leslie a chance to come back on those straight away.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it comes back to what kind of society we want to have. So as someone who led the effort on universal basic income, I would definitely say I've got a vested interest in looking at that. I think it's been interesting to look at the studies where universal basic income has been introduced, and there's different versions of how that works. I think the pilot that's underway, I think, will be helpful in actually shaping that, and there are other pilots elsewhere. John McDonnell, our Chancellor, has also engaged with some academics around further work around universal basic income. So what we've done really is to try to prioritise, if we are elected in government, what needs to happen on day one. And the first thing that needs to happen on day one is that we need to stop the injustice that's already within the current universal credit system. I think what we also recognise is that this is an opportunity to bring dignity to the welfare system. But as I said, that also sits hand in hand with what we do in the workplace by making sure that employers are also treating people with dignity and paying them a decent salary. So I think it's not about one or the other. I think we do need to look more creatively about kind of systems we want, and I think that does have to sit alongside our value system about what kind of society we want. As someone who has been made redundant 3 times in our working life, then I know the challenges that that can face. And it is then about trying to ensure, I wouldn't put a bet on that if I was you. I think it is about the dignity that you treat people in the workplace. I think it is about ensuring that even when people are not in work, then it's about how do you help support them back into work if that's possible, and how do you make sure that people have the support that they need so that they're not in the position that we have with universal credit, where people don't know when their next payment is going to come. They don't know if they are going to pass their assessment. And very often these appointments are cancelled at very short notice. You've got very stressed about even going along to even have that assessment. All of these things are not leading to the kind of society that we want to live in. We've talked about hostile environment in the immigration system, but actually the hostile environment is also in the welfare system. And I do think we have to get back to first principles and look at that. So I think my personal view is I think we need to be open to what would be a better and more dignified way of treating people. And I do think that universal basic income is one of those things that we should continue to explore.
And just while we've still got time for your answer, this gentleman was very clear about the risk of a rising Tory vote in Scotland and the potential of how you mitigate some of that in an independent Scotland versus as part of the United Kingdom. Have you got a response to that gentleman's
Well, I guess
question?
your opportunity comes first to mitigate that on the 12th of December. So you can either sit and have another 5 years of Boris, or you can embrace the Labour Party with its radical manifesto, which will alleviate a lot of the issues and concerns that actually you've all been highlighting tonight. So that choice is yours. You can choose, because I'll tell you that's what's coming first. And if it's a question of prioritisation, and if you care about your society and you care about people, then the choice is pretty clear. If you want Boris Johnson out at number 10, there's only going to be one other occupant, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Neil, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Bill, first of all, I mean, the Tory Labour seesaw that you made an observation of, and the reshaping of Scottish politics after 2014 is a really interesting, development. I don't think anyone could have predicted in 2017 that we would have Conservative councillors across West Fife in almost every ward. I still find it hard to get my head around that. For me, it's perhaps it's the comfort of being in a middle class. I don't know. I've no real answer for it. Perhaps it's a unionist issue that unionists have grouped around Ruth Davidson's message. It's really hard to understand. But do I think it's got longevity? I'm not sure. I know that in some areas there has been a spike up in Conservative votes in Labour households in this election where people want to get Brexit done. And, my thoughts on that is if you get Brexit, you get done. It's that serious. Going on to David's point, I mean, I think mental health is probably one of the biggest casualties of the work capability assessments. And let's not forget that the work capability assessment was introduced under Gordon Brown's premiership. There's a fundamental principle here that, and it's something that I've, I guess, embodied in my life, is that people who don't feel that they matter, who are given the message either by the state or a community that they don't matter, tend to suffer. And the real challenge is making sure that everyone not only feels that, or not only we say, oh, they matter, but they have to feel that they matter. And so we have to take all of these deliberately obscure and overly long, dehumanising assessments out of a benefit system altogether. I know of a friend of mine who has a profoundly disabled son. He's not getting any better, but she has had to go through that lengthy assessment so many times to say it's not any different. Or people who are at the end of life who are forced to they're told that they have to go for return to work interviews because they're not deemed ill enough. People in their last 6 months of life. I can't believe we're there. I think that is so dehumanising, so unfair. But there are other things that are important in all of this, and that's 0 hours contracts. They need to be banned. It's an absolute joke. And last point is on Brexit. All of these things that we're talking about tonight are at risk. It's so important to understand that.
Thank you, Neil. And Scott, do you want to come in to finish?
Yeah, first on the questions of the question of the Tory proliferation in Scotland. Yeah, I can't really remember a time in my sort of adult life, my sort of politically active, aware life, where the Tories weren't somewhat of a force, being essentially a child of the referendum, if you like. I don't see their 23-25% they tend to get nationally is particularly worrying. Their media darling, Ruth Davidson, is now gone. You know, the nice face on the toxic brand. I think it will erode their support in the long term quite significantly. Murdo Fraser and Jackson Carlow are not nice, affable people. Michelle Ballantyne, yes. They're rotten to their core, and I don't think will chime with the average voter. On the simple platitudes they put out on their election material, no indie ref to get Brexit done. These aren't simple ideas, and they're conveyed as such, and it does their electoral prospects no harm at the ballot box. But people are going to feel disillusioned when they don't deliver these things. Get Brexit done, well, trade negotiations take on average about 13 years. That's not going to be done in a matter of weeks, never mind months. Let the Tories play out. They are not going to go down well in Scotland. They're hugely disliked now. When they can't meet their promises, people will stop backing them. They'll look for an alternative political home, whether that's going to be something more traditional, like those voters going back to Labour or seeing the Lib Dems or the Greens or the SNP. Who knows? I'll touch on the social security question as well. I'm so sorry, mate. I mean, it is bloody horrible going to that job centre, being looked at like you're nothing, getting sanctioned if you're late. Been in that situation myself. It's absolutely horrible. Most people that are in poverty are in work. When did that become the norm? When did that become acceptable in the 21st century in one of the richest countries in the world? It's an absolute bloody scandal, right? And something we all are backed against, and I think needs a significant more amount of attention in this election. 0 hours contracts got to go. New Zealand have got rid of them, done no harm at all. Wages are low, don't keep up with inflation. They should be indexed to the CPI. They should outpace any inflation and be set by an independent organisation like the Living Wage Foundation. If you want to give people if people have fair pay, they will do a good day's work. Fair work for fair pay was a central tenet of the Labour movement in the 20th, and it should be a tenet in the 21st century as well. Housing has been seen as an investment and not a human right. Housing is not something you Airbnb for Christmas. It's not a machine. It's for living in. And allowing people to own their own homes, such as people in my generation who are massively delaying buying their own homes because they can't get mortgages. That's something we need to address as well. All these form a complex mingling of inequality, and we need to address them all. You can't address one to fix the whole problem. Every single one of those policies needs to be enforced.
Thank you, Scott. A couple of questions have skirted around the issue of independence, so let's crack straight on into that area. We've got an opener question, but I'm sure there will be many, many more from the audience. If the SNP win a majority of Scottish Westminster seats, should any UK Prime Minister be allowed to stand in the way of a second independence referendum? Leslie Laird.
Well, we've been very clear about our position. No, I'm quite happy to sit and spell it out if you just all hold yourself back. What we are saying, if we are in government, our priorities will not be focused on independence. Our priorities in those first few years of a Labour government will be to address actually most of the issues that you've just touched on here tonight, that you all say are really fundamentally important to you in your everyday lives. And that is why our focus and our agenda will be, in those early years, focused on climate change, focused on regenerising and focusing on our economy, focusing on those 120,000 houses that we want to ensure are built in Scotland, focusing on investing in the kind of wages and salary that people should be earning and having that dignity in work. That is where our priorities will be. It will also be about getting Brexit done, not in the Tory sense, but in the sense of actually putting that back to the people. Because what has been demonstrated through this whole Brexit process is the inability of Parliament to reach a conclusion on where we are. We have seen 3 Tory Prime Ministers come and go over the Brexit period. We have seen all sorts of manoeuvres within Parliament to try to really thwart Parliament in terms of unearthing and scrutinising the deal that has been presented. We've had to use the humble address in order to hold this government to account. We've had Parliament prorogued to stop us even debating the issue. It's absolutely clear that if you leave Boris Johnson in number 10, then we are just going to have more of the same. That is why we've said that after all of this time, after these years of dithering and delay, it needs to go back to the people. And that is what we've committed to. And that will be our priorities in the years of a Labour government.
And just to clarify, while we still have time, what does the first early years mean to a Labour government?
Well, I think if you look at our progressive agenda, you will see that there's quite an aggressive list in those areas. And what we've said is those early years. That could be anything, I don't know, 3 to 5 years is probably a period of time that people recognise as early years. But I think what we also need to recognise is that there will be Scottish Parliament elections in 2021. And clearly, as a democratic party, as a party of self-determination, we do recognise that there will be a choice for people in 2021. And again, I think that will be something for the people of Scotland at that time. But right now, that is a hypothetical question, because right now, the fundamental issue that is facing this general election is simply this: do you or do you not want Boris Johnson to continue in number 10? Because that is the fundamental issue. Do you or do you not want to have a say on Brexit? Do you or do you not want to stop universal credit? Do you or do you not want an economy that works for all and restores to dignity? Because if you want those things, you've got a very simple decision on the 12th of December, because you can make that decision, elect a Labour government, and that agenda can start on the 13th of December.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. There's a couple of comments in the audience. So there's a gentleman right over here in the burgundy top, I think. Yes, sir. There's someone coming to you now.
Thank you very much. It's just a question mainly for Leslie. Suppose we're going to have a second Brexit referendum, and suppose the result is exactly the same as the previous one, namely England wanting to leave and Scotland wanting to remain. Would you then take Scotland out of Europe against its will?
Okay, thank you, sir. And there was a question from a lady in the striped top here at the back, I think. Yep.
It's a question for Leslie as well. I would like to ask why you think it's democratic to take the Brexit referendum back to the people for another vote, but it's not democratic to allow the people of Scotland to have a decision on an indirect too, when the majority of people in Scotland voted SNP on a manifesto that if there was big material change, they would be allowed a second referendum. Because that's undemocratic.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to go along the panel and come back to you, Leslie. You'll be able to answer that question. So, Scott, let's come to you next, and Leslie will get a chance to answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's quite telling that Leslie could answer the first question without lying when asked what her clear position was.
That's it. What was I lying about? I think you need to, we're here
Sorry,
tonight.
laughing, not lying.
No, well,
You were laughing.
well, I don't think that's what
Anyways,
I
I'm
heard.
good.
I don't think that's what
Well,
I heard.
apologies.
I
Apologies.
don't think that's what I
Freudian
heard.
slip. Okay.
Well, I don't think it was Freudian, and we're here tonight at Equalities Hustings, where we're talking about dignity of debate. But to use that phrase in that context is really just completely and utterly inappropriate. And let me just clarify, the reason we're laughing is because I think we all recognise...
Well, Leslie, I think I was asked the
question. We all
question.
recognise... Well, you've opened this debate up in this way. We all recognise, I think, I was trying to bring a little bit of light humour to clearly a situation where I think it's fair to see from the selection of topics that there's a very strong independence group of people in the audience tonight. So it wasn't about being disrespectful, it's absolutely about recognising that I am probably holding a minority view here, and if we can't see the humour in that, then by gosh, we really have lost the plot.
Let's give Scott a chance to respond to the questions. Thanks,
Well,
Leslie.
I'm sorry for offending you, Leslie. I did mean to say laughing, because you were laughing at the prospect, and so was everyone else at your clear position, because I don't think it is clear, right? I think that's a very fair point to make. For myself and my party, I think to have NDREF 2 before the end of a negotiation period or a transition period for Brexit is essential. 62% of Scots voted Remain. England clearly, it looks like wants England and Wales clearly want a different path. If that's the path they choose, good on them. It will harm workers' rights, it will harm food regulations, it will harm us dealing with the climate crisis on an international scale by leaving the European Union. I could not be more against it. I think the potential an independent Scotland could have with the central bank to invest in its people and address the climate crisis simultaneously is a huge opportunity. I think most people would buy into that message for an alternative economy. If a pro-Indy majority is returned in Scottish Parliament in 2021, I think it is, then no PM should stand in the way. That's a clear mandate. No PM should be able to do that.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Neil?
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so I think, everybody, where they can, should vote SNP. And it's really important that pro-Scottish MPs are returned in numbers in this election, because we have been ignored, humiliated, laughed at throughout the last term, and it is completely unacceptable. We were promised a union of equals, and it has been anything but. If we're talking about equality, this is not an equal relationship. But I made a few notes when Leslie was speaking, but I think she made the point I'm going to make for me, which is, do we want the dysfunction of Westminster for the next 3 to 5 years? Either Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn making the decisions for Scotland while Scotland continues to be ignored. The fact that Scotland has already made its choice very, very clear on the EU with a 62% majority. But I think the point that you made was really important. How many times do we have to answer a question we've already answered about the EU? The risk of a Boris Johnson government and the risk of a Corbyn government, who will possibly not have a huge amount of support up here, is very, very clear. I don't believe Scotland needs a second referendum on the EU. We've made a very, very clear statement on that, and support is continuing to rise. And it's democratically incoherent to argue for a second EU ref and then oppose a second independence referendum. The people of Scotland have made a choice. The EU is not perfect. I'm not saying it's brilliant. There are bits of it that I really don't like, but certainly the social freedoms and some of the good bits, if you like, are really important to our way of life. So the fundamental question is, all of the issues we've spoken about tonight, about poverty, about in-work benefits, about in-work poverty, all of those issues, do we want them to be decided by Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, or do we want to make those decisions ourselves? That is fundamentally the issue. Are we going to be better at doing it than they are? And I think we are, and I think that makes the argument very, very clear.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Leslie, both of the questions were put directly to you, so let's give you a chance to some extra time, if you like, to answer those questions.
Okay, well, the franchise for the European election was a UK-wide one. And that is the basis around which democracy operates. We were part of that franchise, and that is the decision that we've made.
Franchise? It's a union.
Well, the voting franchise was a UK franchise. That is the principle around which it was set. We also had a vote in 2014 where the people of Scotland did make their opinions known. You've touched on the fact that there's been a material change because of the Brexit position. As yet, there hasn't been a material change because we haven't left yet. We have not left yet. And if there is a Labour government elected on the 12th of December, then the opportunity to put that question back, and we may not yet leave. And therefore, the question of fundamental change has not really happened.
Let's just give the candidates a chance to answer your question, please.
What we've seen throughout this debate is just that kind of polarisation, that we all have very passionate views about what we want to see out of this debate. We are very clear about where we are going. We are clear that we want to we are clear because we want to bring the country back together. We recognise that in this country there are polarised views on this issue, but there are also polarised views on independence. There are polarised views because people see that as a route from where you think you are today. And what we are saying here is that with a Labour government, that could change. That could change very, very radically. But to go back to your point about a mandate, when independence was first talked about, we did talk about the settled will of the Scottish people. And the settled will of the Scottish people was determined in 2014. At the last election, that goalpost has now moved to the settled will of Parliament. So through a kind of coalition between the Greens and the SNP, who are a minority
Not a coalition, confidence and supply.
Confidence and supply. Then there has been a push to try and find a franchise for another referendum. But I would put it to you that I don't believe that right now, in the midst of everything that's going on, that would be the right economic and social choice to be making. Well, I think it might not be your question, but it's part of my answer.
Okay. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Well, we have to finish the process.
I think Leslie's given her answer.
I believe we have to finish
I think
the process that we've started.
I think Leslie's given the answer
and I
that
believe that is the way
she's
to
happy
go.
with.
You and I fundamentally disagree about what the route out of this is, and we just have to respectfully just leave it at that.
Thank you,
but
Leslie.
I believe there is a different course to take, and that's the course that my party are on.
Thank you, Leslie. We offered a follow-up question on independence for you, so we'll do so for the other candidates. Neil and Scott, both of you come from a pro-independence stance, and that's entirely reasonable. How, though, do we address the fact that there were a number of people across Scotland who still don't believe in independence? If we're to become one nation as you would like us to become in the future, how do we encourage those people to come on board? How do we bring the country back together again, whether it's an EU referendum or independence? Sorry, Neil, let's go with you first.
Thanks, Stuart. I just want to make one point on the last question, which is, and it just spells out exactly what the problem is. It was a UK-wide franchise. That means that it didn't matter, and it doesn't matter what Scotland votes. We will always be outvoted by a much larger neighbour. And in the preparation for that referendum, Nicola Sturgeon tried to ensure that there was a triple lock on the vote, so that every constituent part of the UK had to support leave, or it couldn't happen. And that's a fundamental problem with where we are. That's why people are so unhappy. But in terms of, whether we become an independent country or not, Scotland is currently 50-50, and that's without any new independence referendum being called, and that's without any campaign. So there's a very clear shift in mood. It's not as much as I would like it to be, but it's there. And certainly the conversations that I've been having on the doorstep in the early part of this campaign, Brexit has become a really important part of that, and the consequences of Brexit are making people realise that if we want to preserve our way of life, the things that are important to us, so our health service, the kind of rights and protections that we've spoken about tonight, then the only way to do that is to have an independence referendum next year, and vote to leave the UK and retain our EU membership. And that is where we are.
Thank you, Neil. Scott?
Yeah, so the question, how do we encourage no voters? I think by offering them something completely different, something that we did quite well to offer in 2014, a bold, a radical, a left-wing vision for Scotland, something that, a pledge that could take everyone in. I think a Green New Deal, bringing industry and jobs, especially to formerly industrial areas like Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, while simultaneously addressing the climate crisis, I think most people would find irresistible. Tying that with living wage, affordable homes, people being part of a nation of 27 other countries in the EU, to live, work and love as they please across a huge continent. I think that's so much more of a positive message than build a wall, keep everyone out, England can go it alone, isolationist, nationalist. I don't think that's what people want in this country.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We've got time for a couple more questions around this topic, if you want them. If not, we can move on. I don't see any hands up, so let's crack on then. Okay, so we've spent about half an hour roughly on each of the three topics so far. We're going to move on to the climate emergency and a question around that to open up the debate. The world faces a climate emergency and Scotland has tough decisions to take in the coming years if it's to reach its ambition of being carbon neutral. With that in mind, is now the time to decommission the Mossmorton plant in this constituency? Let's open with Neil Hanby.
Okay, so Scotland has the world's leading and most ambitious climate targets. And I think that's something that we should be proud of. But the reality is that not enough countries are aiming that high or replicating the action that's being taken. And some of the progress that we could be making is being held back by policies that are controlled by Westminster. I'm thinking of certain things like carbon capture and storage projects that have lost funding, the problem with bringing industry in for renewable, the renewable sector, which has damaged businesses like Bifab. These are all things that we should be absolutely at the forefront of technological design and implementation. In terms of Mossmorton, which is, obviously a very important issue, there is, I think, a need to deal with Mossmorton. It's a hydrocarbon factory, if you like, but there's also a bit of balance to be struck there, which is that we will, if we want to get to a carbon neutral status, we need to get our diesel and petrol vehicles off the road and move to electronic vehicles. And electronic vehicles, if they're going to run well, need robust plastics to build their structure. That's how the bodies are built for them. So we do need plastic, but that means so the Mossmorton could be much more environmentally friendly, and it is, from my meetings, both with the Shell element of the plant and with the Exxon element of the plant, they are taking that seriously at the moment and progressing all of the projects that they can do. But the one thing that I did pick up, which I think is really important and goes back to carbon neutral transport, is that they, as part of the byproduct of the process in the cracker, they generate hydrogen. Now, it's not commercial grade hydrogen yet, but it's something that they could do, and that would offset a huge amount of the carbon that they currently pollute. Now, there are lots of safety questions which we haven't got time to go into, but I would hope that the investment that's being put in will go a long way to reducing some of the challenges that the local community have faced with unplanned flaring, because that's unacceptable.
Thanks for sticking to time, Neil. Thank you. Leslie, let's move on to you.
Well, this is a case in point which is very, very close to my heart. When I was first elected in 2017, within the first week of my election, the most unbelievable flaring started in Westmoreland. And what I've got here is my documentation of every single interaction, every single activity that I have undertaken as MP to challenge the Mossmoran. So while we can all recognise that Mossmoran, I think, has a good employment record, provides money into the economy, we also need to recognise that we are in very different times from when that plant was first produced. We also need to recognise that they are not good neighbours. They have not been good neighbours to the community that lives around the Mossmoran plant. They have had various efforts. When I started, I spoke to all the community councils and all the community groups. And what I discovered was that each of them had all tried individually to try to hold Mossmoran to account. And that's why I formed the Mossmoran Working Group, cross-community and cross-party, because I also pulled in Health and Safety Executive, SEPA, I pulled in the companies themselves, because up until that point, nobody was prepared to engage and to actually fundamentally address the real issues that were facing the community. Their concerns were being ignored, and particularly around health. And the recent health report simply shows testimony to the fact that those concerns are real and legitimate. And frankly, it is disappointing that on 3 separate occasions, the minister responsible has reneged on taking any action in terms of an independent review. We currently have ongoing health and safety and SEPA investigations. They are currently on a final written warning. They are currently now having to invest in new technology in relation to flaring, which has been absolutely unacceptable. We've just had the recent incident where the boilers have exploded, not 1 but 2. And we had a bit of a spat at the last working group where there was a debate about whether it was an explosion. The Health and Safety Executive's description of that incident was it was an explosion. So let us be clear, it's not just about all bad and all good, but what we do need to recognise that the agenda is changing, and what we've said is there does need to be a just transition, and we will need to have just transition from where we are if we are going to meet our climate targets. But the Mossmoran is a case in point. You cannot be a business and be a bad neighbour, and they have been a bad neighbour for far too long. And what the Mossmoran working group that I have formed is starting to do is to hold those companies to account, to make them and the agencies come in and play their part in holding their regulatory authority and making it work, because up until now they hadn't. And that's why, if I'm elected, I will ensure that the attention is not taken off these issues. These are vital issues, vital concerns, and frankly, the response prior to this had just not been good enough.
Thank you, Leslie, for sticking to time. And Scott, I imagine this is an issue that you're quite
something I've thought about
comfortable
once or
with.
twice. Yeah. So the International Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC report, gives us 10 years to reach net carbon neutrality. It's a problem beyond the scope of anything of the last 60 years. It's something that requires more than a blitz spirit. It needs wholesale changes to the way we live our lives and order our economy. I think it's admirable that we have world-beating leading targets, but they're miles away. We brought this to the floor of the Chamber in Scottish Parliament earlier this year. Despite the fact that Labour's conference had agreed it wanted to reach net zero emissions by 2030, it voted against it in the Chamber. The SNP's motion passed that they should reach that point by 2045. Well, our proposals are led by science, not by a lack of ambition. 2030 is the date because it has to be the date. We can't choose that. How we get there, that's the main problem. I think Mossmoran is something that there's a not to put a terrible pun in it, but there's a huge cloud around. People tend to think it produces energy. Largely, it's an ethylene cracker, and it does other things such as distill chemicals. It produces single-use plastics for the most part. It's not something that we need on the scale we have now. Plastic use and demand is in decline. We cannot keep supplying it in the same way that we have been before. They are a neighbour that act in bad faith. They do not care about that community. When they're under pressure, they will pay for some school activities for people out to see them, such as my mother's own primary school that she works in. That's as much as they care, is getting some good PR. Putting a couple of million in occasionally just to keep some good faith with the neighbours. I think it's despicable what they do. I think it's, unless they can reach zero emissions by 2030 and they can stop the flaring, or at least limit it severely, it has to go. They're not going to reach those ambitions. It has to go. When it comes to carbon capture, I'll just add, people talk about it like it's this golden saviour on the horizon. It's going to come. It's a technology that hasn't been invented yet. We might as well propose flying cars to fix congestion problems in cities. We need to get realistic. We need to have 40% of Scotland covered in trees, which is the national average for Europe. We need a Green New Deal for Scotland to address this. And the only people talking about this are the Greens. The only reason it's asked as a question is because of the work we've done on it and listened to communities.
Thank you, Scott. Everybody's getting quite good at keeping to that time limit, which is good. Any questions from the audience around climate change, Mossmorton specifically? Yes, gentleman here, someone with a mic, just in the front row. And then the gentleman over here with a white shirt beside you, Pat.
Thank you, Leslie. You formed the Mossmorton group? Working group, right. Did you think about raising the Mossmorton working group in one of your early day motions from last parliamentary session?
Well, there's a very simple answer to that.
Can we just take the other question and then we'll come back and answer both? That's your question? So yeah, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks. I'm a Labour councillor and I have the responsibility for economy, tourism, strategic planning, transportation, just to make it nice and clear that with the longest title in the council, it takes me a while. I just wanted to come a couple of things. The Fife Council passed a motion and made it policy just a few months ago that there should be a strategy to decommission Mossmorton and compensation should be sought for the communities around it. That is the Fife Council policy, and we were to write to the Minister, and we did. Rosanna Cunningham will not have an independent inquiry. She's been asked a number of times by Fife Council and by MPs and MSPs, so forth. I suppose the question to this is this. Neil, I couldn't work out if you were for decommissioning it or not. So a simple answer is, should it be decommissioned or shouldn't it? It's Fife Council policy to find a way forward to do that. And as a spokesperson on that, I think it's important. It's nice and clear for everybody in the room.
Thank you. I think, if I'm right, Fife Council have requested twice now that this has been taken, 3 times, sorry, this has been taken to the Scottish Government for action. Neil, let's come in. You can respond on that first.
I'm just, I would like a chance to ask a question that has been sent to us because we are trying to be as interactive as possible. So there's people actually sent in their questions in advance to us as well. I think it is kind of relating to climate change, about tourism, and recently there has been a lot of talks about the expansion of the Edinburgh airport, but then, however, I mean, that in itself would have a major impact on the environmental health that we have in Fife. But then I think there's also people, in terms of wanting to access public transport, people are feeling that they are handicapped, that's their words, not my words, handicapped in Kirkcaldy for travel to Edinburgh Airport. The airport bus does not include Kirkcaldy. Why the service cannot be improved to include the main city of Fife. And it is a reserved issue because the airport buses are mainly kind of like subsidized by the airport themselves, which is, as I was told by the airport, is a reserved matter, the whole function of the BAA. So I think, just in case people wondering, but I think the airport buses tend to be as a negotiation and provided and subsidised by the airport.
Okay, thank you. Neil, so coming back on that point on Fife Council's policy, the Minister's refusal to launch an inquiry, and also about local transport and the impact that that might have on the environment.
Certainly. Altony, we had a resolution when... Well, no, I'm going to give you a reasoned answer. At the recent SNP conference, I spoke in favour of a resolution to reduce plastic, particularly single-use plastics, by 2025 to net zero. And one of the comments that I made on that was about the need to have a transition from hydrocarbons to carbon-free, and that includes the decommission of plants like Musmoran. I think everybody agrees that that needs to happen. But the fundamental problem that we've got there is we need to make sure that we've got industry for people to transition to. So the example that I got was, as a country with a huge resource of potatoes, seaweed, and other such things that you can make biodegradable plastics from, we have zero capacity. We don't make any biodegradable products in the UK. It's all imported, and if you import stuff, that creates carbon. So I think that we need to look very carefully about how we can enhance and build on that industry. I think that's a really important way to build that transition, to capture the scientific knowledge that exists within plants like Musmoran and translate that across to meaningful jobs in new industry. Because, you know, we could say transition, but we have to think where these people are going to work and how we're going to value their skills. So that's kind of in the nuts and bolts, that's my position on it.
Okay, Scott, let's come in for you next.
Yeah, or do you want to?
Do you want to come in first? I thought you were finished there. Okay, you've got about a minute left. Okay.
I was finished with Alney. Okay, in terms of airport buses, I didn't know that, so thank you for telling me. That's really helpful. With regards to public transport and free from the constraints of party for the moment, my personal view on transport is that we need to move swiftly as possible, to much lower fares on rail, free buses, and that would include those kind of services to airports. We can have electric buses, we can have hydrogen driven buses, and this is based on an experience when I was in the Faroe Islands, and I went there, got into the town and said, oh, where do you get a bus? Got to the bus and said, how much is it? Oh no, everything's free. They have a completely free public transport system, and we need to aim for that. That's the only real way that you have equity of access and equity, so people don't have to worry about, can I afford to go and get this job? You know, people take low-paid work, but it's far away, and they spend most of their wages getting there and back. That's a ludicrous situation. So I think that would be my answer to that. We need to move to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Let's move on to Scott briefly.
Yeah, transport's the single biggest emitter of CO2 in Scotland. Unlike most of you, probably, who aren't political nerds like myself, I've actually gone through the programme for government, for this year's Scottish Government. And carbon capture, okay, it's a fantasy, it's a hope. It doesn't exist yet. We can't rely on that. Carbon-free flight, they hope to bring in by 2041. Again, pie in the sky hopes. Ultimately, public transport should be about connecting people to social, economic opportunities. Should be there for people to move around without a burden and without putting a burden on the environment doing so. Active travel should be at least 10% of the transport budget. It's about 2.6, 2.7 for the coming year. It's nowhere near enough. Free buses is our party policy. Phased in over time, but given immediately to under 21s, if we can bring it in, to allow young people the freedom and opportunity to move around the country, to enhance the opportunities they have in their lives. Transport shouldn't be a barrier, and I'm more than willing personally to pay higher taxation so that we get that. When it comes to railways, overpriced, cancelled often, people are let down, they're paying huge amounts of their wages just to get to their work and back. It's no way for people to live their lives. Public ownership of railways is it has to be the way to go on this. We've seen it across Europe. There are publicly owned companies in the Netherlands, in Italy, and Switzerland as well, I think, that do a great service. Yeah. Well, I don't want to list them all. We'll be here all night. Right? Europe knows how to do this, and they can do it well. They're more efficient. They're cheaper. Germany, and we need to follow that example. Not dueling the A9 or the A92 for 2 billion and spending a mere 70 million to open up the Leamouth Railway. 70 million of that opened up opportunities for one of the most multiple deprived areas in North East Fife that Scotland has. Clearly, public transport can be a bit of a silver bullet in giving people an opportunity to move around. It's essential in everyday life. 21st century, we need to get on board. Car travel should not be the only option to live a normal life.
Thank you, Scott. And Leslie, let's just recap on this gentleman's question, which is around what you've done in Parliament to back up the work that you've done in the Most Modern Working Group.
A lot of people don't understand that as a member of the shadow cabinet, I actually don't get to sign EDMs. I actually don't get to speak as a backbencher. So as a member of the shadow cabinet, there are parliamentary protocols. That's the shadow cabinet. That's the shadow cabinet. Yes, so because you're in the front bench with the shadow cabinet, parliamentary protocol does not allow you to speak from the benches. The only time I'm allowed to speak from the floor of the House is on the occasions when I am leading a debate or I am responding every 6 weeks and holding the Tory government to account in Scottish questions. That doesn't mean to say that I don't have other routes in which I do. You can look at my record. Over the course, I've submitted 157 written questions. I've also had numerous meetings with the MOD, for example, in relation to the Dalgety Bay radiation. I've also met with ministers in relation to the whole energy situation that we have, and particularly Westmoreland. So because I can't speak from the backbenches doesn't mean that I am not an effective MP for this constituency, because being in the shadow cabinet means I actually have access to other ministers, to civil servants, and actually only this week I have still been chasing down the issue in relation to Dalgety Bay radiation based on concerns that were highlighted to me by the Sailing Club. And that's because I've built up that relationship with those civil servants over the last 2.5 years. And even although I'm in this neutral state, I still have a relationship that I can say there's a problem, and I can make sure that that is not going to fall through the cracks while we're in this period of time. In some respects, it's been very frustrating, because the only time you can make that contribution, I can't also speak in Westminster Hall debates. So while you're in the shadow cabinet, there are restrictions that sit around that. But when I have been at the dispatch box, and I should just reflect that the first time I was at the dispatch box was practically 2 weeks after I was elected. So there are other ways to work, and that's how I have chosen to do that. I want to answer the question too on flights and flight paths. So again, I was a key supporter and campaigner with the communities who were opposing the flight paths that were going to affect particularly Dunfermline, Dalgety Bay, and the whole Inverkeithing and Burnt Island area. Again, I can show you chapter and verse on all the things I've done in that regard. I've held various public meetings on that particular issue. And the reason that we have now managed to get the initial flight paths rejected and thrown out was because using my previous knowledge and experience from working life, there are principles of consultation that you have to use. And Edinburgh Airport, in their approach, did not use those principles of consultation, which government and other bodies need to use. And that is why that consultation was scrapped, and that is why they are now having to reconsult. So the battle is not won, and that needs to be done. But to address the point about transport, I have to say, again, look at Labour's manifesto. We are proposing a green industrial revolution. We're going to nationalise the rail service. I'm passionate about rail. I've campaigned on rail when I had the economy brief. And in Fife, we pay 3 times more per rail mile for many other journeys. We have had the worst service for the last 12 months. Alec Hines committed to me in a public meeting which we held here in Kirkcaldy last year that he would fix and deliver an improvement to Fife's road services. He said we would get new carriages, and that has not been delivered. And the multiple issues that he highlighted to me were not network related. On this occasion, he said the issues they had were down to the basically not enough drivers for the new trains, and problems in terms of the assimilation of that in terms of service delivery.
Thank you, Leslie.
Here we are 12 months on, it still ain't fixed, and Labour will nationalise the rail service, and we will invest in public transport, not least of which is giving local councils the right to run municipal partnerships, to actually have municipal bus services, and to stop the privatisation of our proud bus services.
Thank you, Leslie, for that. We're almost out of time completely, I'm afraid. We are compiling our intention to vote figures, and we'll get them just in a second. But in the spirit of reconciliation, candidates, at this very unusual time for an election in December, let's imagine for a second that you three are all spending Christmas Day together. How joyful that would be for you, I'm sure. Tell us each in just a couple of sentences, what present would you buy for each other? Why? Let's start with Scott.
Okay, my partner is going to be very disappointed for a start. That is such a hard question. I wish you hadn't asked it. Do you know what? I think I would give Leslie an apology because I didn't mean to say she was lying. I did genuinely mean to say she was laughing. That's what I'd get you, Leslie, in a card, a nice one. For Neil, I would get him a nice Christmas jumper that was made by a reputable company with eco-friendly material that paid the living wage.
He likes his jumpers. Neil, over to you next.
I'm just going to go with the spirit of the moment. Scott, you're getting slippers. And Leslie, I think I would get you a tasteful handbag.
And Leslie?
Well, I think we're in for a kind of cool Christmas. So
Oh, just pop your mic so that everyone can hear your answer.
I was originally going to say that I think we could share a nice Christmas lunch chatting over Labour's exciting manifesto, around which actually, based on tonight's discussion, there is actually a majority consensus for a lot of the policies that I think we would all like to see in the new year. So I wish us all for Christmas actually a better new year than we've had for the last few years under the Conservative government. And I actually think that's the best Christmas present, not only for us, but for all of you as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, Elric, I think we're ready for your amazing graphics. We're good to go this time?
Hopefully.
Okay, so this is party or voting intention after tonight's debate. Let's see if there's been any change.
So this is where we vote, it works? Okay, it does. Yes, it does. Okay, so initial poll. I've corrected the colors, so I hope that makes sense. And now, so there we go. So initially, 55 for Neil, 11 here for Scott. Sorry, Scott, for missing you initially. So there we go. And it was 16 and 16 on this side. It was undecided for Leslie and undecided, yes, and then 0% for the Liberal Democrats and the Unionist Party here. So exit poll is 64, so plus 9% for Neil Henley. The loss was clearly from the undecideds tonight, and plus 1% for Leslie Laird at 17%. 11 unchanged at the moment for Scott, and 6% is undecided still, and that's here tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It just leaves for me to say thank you on behalf of Fife Centre for Equalities and Pink Saltire. Thank you very much for coming out. Whatever you do on December the 12th, make sure you just go out and vote for someone, hopefully. Oh, closing statement. Of course we have. Yes, we've got closing statements to go. So, with that in mind, you've heard the results of tonight's poll from inside the room. Does that make a difference to what you're about to say as you wrap up? Let's start with Leslie Laird as your closing statement, please.
Well, on the basis that this is about equality and what unites us, and I think that's the tone around which we have tried to have tonight's discussion and debate, then I think there's a lot that unites us in this room as to why you should vote Labour on the 12th of December. Because if you want to have a radical green agenda, if you want to have a climate change manifesto delivered by a government that fundamentally really does care about it, then the answer to that is vote Labour on the 12th. If you want to have new jobs and new investment and regeneration in many of our communities, then there is only one way to deliver that, and that is to vote Labour on the 12th of December. If you are serious about eradicating the scourge and the cruelty of universal credit, then the only way to address that is to vote Labour on the 12th of December. If you want to see 120,000 new homes built across Scotland, then the only way to do that is to vote Labour. If you want 100 billion of investment and the prospect of a better future than we have at the moment, then vote Labour. And if you want a vote in terms of determining the outcome of Brexit, then please vote Labour and vote for Leslie Laird on the 12th of December.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Neil Hanby, you're going to be next.
Thanks, Stuart. I used to vote Labour. I voted Labour most of my youth and into my adulthood, and I lived in London for a long time, so there was no SNP to vote for. And I came back up, well, I stopped voting Labour when they invaded Iraq. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So there's a couple of elections I voted Lib Dem before they completely tarnished their reputation as far as I'm concerned. But in 2010, I entered politics, and I entered politics for one principal reason, which was I never wanted Scotland to be subjected to Conservative governments that we didn't vote for any longer. And that is still the guiding principle that I have. In 2014, at the doorstep when we were talking about independence, the people of Scotland voted for a status quo that is gone, that doesn't exist and will never return. We spoke to people about the possibility of a Boris Johnson and a Farage coalition, and we are now heading into exactly that territory where Farage may indeed be a Lord. We've got a choice in this election. We either vote for the old parties that are located in Westminster, or we vote with confidence for a better future and to protect, and not only protect, but to enhance the life that we have. And it really is a fundamental choice as that. So the only way, as far as I'm concerned, is to achieve all of that and to tackle the inequalities that we've spoken about tonight, is to vote for someone who will speak with power and authority for this community and for Scotland in Westminster, and will help deliver an independence referendum next year and get us out of this Brexit shambles.
Thank you, Neil. And lastly, Scott.
I've drunk about a litre of water sitting here, so I'll make this very brief.
More information is
If you want a Green New Deal for Scotland that simultaneously addresses the climate crisis and provides the jobs, the infrastructure, the future we need to go forward into the 21st century, you vote Green. We want to see a just transitions for workers. We weren't prepared for the end of coal. We're not prepared for the end of oil, and that is coming. We need to address this now before it is a runaway issue. Farmlands are ruined. Houses can't be sold. Waters rise. We do not want to see our world and humans destroyed in the process. If you want a local MP who will fight on issues both local and national, you vote Green on December the 12th, and I will deliver on climate action. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you very much to all of you for coming along tonight. May I say thanks to all of the FCE and Fife Voluntary Action staff that are in here tonight that have supported the Hustings. And thank you from Nina and I for coming out. Have a safe travel home. Thank you.
Can I